And morning, Diane. So I'd like to start this meeting by recognizing the homeland of the 30 First Nation communities of this area we now call the Fraser Valley Regional District, where we live, work, and learn. Important decisions that we make at a local government level can affect First Nation communities and Indigenous peoples and organizations in many different ways, both today and in the future. So as part of our collective responsibility, I commit that we continually examine the work we do to ensure that our project, plans, initiatives, and discussion are guided by the principles of inclusion, collaboration, and reconciliation. So with that in mind, I'd like to call to order the January 19th meeting of the Electoral Area Services Committee of the Whole.
So just looking for approval of the agenda and late items.
Director McMahon, second Director Davidson. Any discussion? Hearing none. All in favor? Contrary, motion carries. And I was just going to say that the topic of today's discussion is the rather unseemly subject of money. And while many of us think that we would like to strive for higher ideals in life, the fact of the matter is it is the filthy lucre which energizes this organization and which we run. And so it's an important subject that we're going to discuss today. We've all individually met with staff to talk about our individual electoral area specific budgets. And today it is rather a discussion around the EA-wide budgets, which is where we collectively try and decide what's best for the federation of the 8 different electoral areas. So I expect with 8 different directors and 8 very different communities, we're going to see a whole spectrum of views on this, and very likely will be a very broad discussion, but I'm sure that we can reach a consensus and find our best way forward that works for most of us, or hopefully for all of us. So that being said, I think I will turn things back to our CAO.
Thank you. So item 4.1 is the FVRD 2023 to 2027 financial plan electoral area wide services. And we'll just turn things over to our finance team, Kelly Lonsborough and Beth Klein.
Good.
Okay, thank you and good morning, everyone. And we have Beth Klein here to my right, and the two of us will be giving the presentation this morning. So on the screen, we see that we're here to talk about, as Chair Dickey mentioned, the electoral area-wide services as proposed for the draft, the financial plan for 2023 to 2027.
Okay, promotion.
Okay, so this morning we have a large agenda. We've set aside 2 hours. I'm confident we can get through these materials. The electoral area-wide agenda for today is we're going to do a little bit of a budget overview on the assumptions and the parameters that went into the development of the financial plan. The risks that were considered. We'll look at the financial plan timeline. We'll talk about taxation. We'll also talk about assessment and how the two play together, of course. We're going to have a highlighted discussion on assets at risk. Then we'll move over into the financial summaries for the electoral areas, and then we'll get right into the electoral area-wide service area budgets. So today we've selected to go through certain electoral area-wide budgets in detail, and those are ones that require decisions or have higher than inflationary increases that we really want to highlight your attention to. The other service area budgets are included in the resource section, and we're happy to go through those if you have any questions or if there's time permitting. So all of the information is in the materials, including the summaries for each of your electoral areas. I shall note that the electoral area summaries have slightly changed for the taxation impacts as the BC assessment process continues, and we have revised assessment information. So the pencil is sharpened on those as well because the assessments in most cases have gone down. A couple of other things. have a resolution at the end of the presentation looking for the Electoral Area Services Committee to recommend that we move these service area budgets forward into the financial plan that goes to the full board. And so that's at the end. However, if there's questions throughout the presentation, we're happy to entertain them. And we're also happy to take motions throughout the presentation on service area budgets, should you not be satisfied with those budgets. Okay. Okay, moving right along, the budget overview. So this year, we continue to have an ongoing focus on efficiencies and maximizing external funding. We don't believe in doing what was always done. We look to make sure we understand where the dollars are spent in the current year, where they're forecasted to be spent in the current year, and whether or not there's any opportunities to reduce some budgets, transfer dollars to other areas where they might otherwise be needed, and or just reduce budgets. We also look at what is really needed to support our work plan, and when those requests are needed, we have put those forward. We continue to focus on budgets with low surplus and reserve balances. That's to make sure that we have good fiscal responsibility, to have steady taxation, to make sure that our reserves and surplus balances are adequate to meet the future needs of each of the service areas. We also continue to look at our asset management. We have an asset management program we've recently brought forward to the board in November, and we're continuing on that path in 2023. We also have atmospheric river considerations, unapproved projects from the DFA, and interim flood support considerations. These aren't necessarily applicable to all service area budgets, but we note that it was definitely a consideration in the development of these budgets. Okay, risks. What would a financial plan be without risks to consider? So we consider the inconsistent and large increases to residential assessments from last year. It makes things not consistent year over year when the distribution of the residential properties varies amongst each electoral area and also the municipalities. We note that the DFA plan is not yet approved. We have a number of projects still awaiting provincial approval. The asset management replacement values, we have ongoing work. We did a lot of work in 2021 and 2022 to update our projections on what the replacement values of all of our assets are, and we continue to work on that. The risks to that are quite clear if those costs are increasing, and we haven't considered that. So we're doing our best to make sure that we have a balanced perspective. We're not being too aggressive and too unreasonable in the replacement values, but we're trying not to be underestimating as well. And I think we all know it when we go to buy some lettuce. The inflation is significant this year. So we're at around 6 to 7% inflationary rates. Okay, the financial plan timeline. As you may recall, we delayed the financial plan process from prior years to make sure that the new board had full visibility to the financial plan, and the board did not inherit a half-drafted financial plan. So we brought forward the assessment data. We had the assessment data from BC Assessment and calculated approximate taxation impacts. We had our colleagues, the managers and directors throughout the organization preparing their budgets. And then we rolled that up into presentations to the electoral area directors in December, where we had one-on-one meetings. Right now, we've updated our assessment information again as we receive new information from BC Assessment. And today we're here to do our presentation to the Committee of the Whole for the East Committee. And we've also scheduled a municipal CFO consultation for next week to look at the regional service area budgets. And in February, we have the full board Committee of the Whole, where we'll look at all of the budgets, but in particular the regional service areas. And once the Committee of the Whole happens, then we'll be going forward to public consultation. And then we'll come back to the board in March for the final adoption in advance of the legislative timelines of the end of March to have it approved. Okay. Okay, this is a little bit of an update, deeper dive on what I already talked about earlier on the December update. So between the dates of December 13th to the 16th, we spent 16 hours with the electoral area directors to review each of your electoral area budgets. The proposals were finalized. We had a few follow-ups, and the proposals were finalized with each of the electoral area directors. And in total, there were 72 budgets reviewed and supported by the EA directors. We also reviewed Community Works Fund plans so that we make sure that we understand your desires and priorities for the use of the Community Works funds in each of your electoral areas. Okay, so in January, we're here, it's the 19th. We're presenting to the East Committee of the Whole. What we have done is we've updated our estimated taxation impacts using the latest assessment data. Now that data is along the timelines of BC assessment. We have some slides that will speak to that in a little bit. But what we really try to do is, rather than just using the same assessment information that we had in November, we do our best to update the information as we receive it from BC assessment so that you have the latest and greatest information on the approximate taxation impacts for the residents of your communities. And we've updated the Community Works Funds projects that we've understood from your priorities. We've updated those into our financial plan. And as I mentioned, we have our CFO consultation with the municipal CFOs next week. And then we have, of course, our service area presentations today. Okay. The next section is taxation. So the next series of slides covers the process of taxation. Regional district budgeting can be complicated, especially for the taxpayer when it's not part of their everyday life. So it's important to walk through some of the fundamentals. The FVRD financial planning process includes seeking approval on overall tax requisition dollars. It's how much the FVRD requires to maintain and operate its services. We include the estimated taxation impacts to provide insight to the decision makers on the expected tax impacts to the property owners. The FVRD financial process requires our board to approve those budgeted tax dollars required to maintain and operate its services. As you know, the board is not approving the tax rates as is done in the municipal world. So when the FVRD requisitions the provincial rural taxation branch or issues requisitions to member municipalities, it's again for the dollars that we require. And this slide shows an abbreviated timeline for the regional district budgeting. We're currently in step 1. The assessment base has not yet been finalized. All of the estimated tax impacts are just that, they're estimates. By April, when we start the requisition process, the rates will be set. And note that that's after our board has approved our financial plan at the end of March. So this results in the FVRD getting the exact dollars we require. So we tell the province how much we need, and at the point in time when the rates are set, they have the finalized assessment roll, and then the math is done to calculate the exact tax rate required, and that's how we get the exact dollars that we require and that we've approved. This slide illustrates a 2021 property tax notice for a sample property in electoral area H. It's important to show that nearly $4,600 is paid in property taxes, but of that, less than half, about $1,900, comes to the FVRD funding, and then funding for the other agencies is approximately $2,700. We point this out because we do get questions from members of the public, so we're working to make sure that the residents of the area understand that we don't control all of the taxation that's on their property tax notices. Okay. I've touched on the assessment, and we'll go through a few slides on property assessment right now. So BC assessment has a responsibility for property assessments, which are the basis of taxation. Unlike municipalities who typically have one budget and one tax base, each of our nearly 120 service area budgets has its own unique tax base. So the bottom line is the tax impact to a property owner depends on their specific property increases compared to other properties within that same service area. So it's also important to note that the FVRD does not experience windfalls when assessments increase. Again, we receive the dollars that we require. So here, we're showing that 65.3% of the FVRD's total tax base is residential properties. And it's interesting to note that nearly 72% of the electoral area tax base is residential. I'm sure each of you understand that and know that well based on your communities. 65% of the municipal tax base is residential, but overall of the full FVRD, it's 65.3% is residential. Okay. Okay. Assessed values. BC assessment values properties within 9 different property classes. The basis for valuation of these differ, and there are also different tax rates associated with each of the different classes. The data presented in these slides we'll review today, what is based on the completed roll and which is issued at the beginning of January. It is the most current data we have, and we do our best to continue to provide the board and the electoral area directors with the most current information. So BC assessment has implemented processes for the extreme weather assessment. So as those are completed, we expect some property values to change, and that's in line with their timelines. So they have their preliminary roll in November, and then they continue to refine their data, and then it's finalized in April. And also I want to point out that the proportions of the property classes didn't change significantly from 2022, which means residential properties wouldn't have increased at a higher rate than others, although their assessments did increase. Okay. The assessment data timeline. So as we pointed out, the BC assessment data provides us the ability to estimate the average taxation impact to assist us in decision making. The assessment data can change, and therefore the average taxation impacts can also change. The timelines and key relevance of the data for the FVRD is shown on this slide. So right now we're in the middle section of this slide. We have the completed roll, and that was released in January. And then the next notable update from BC assessment would be in April when the data is finalized, and that's after our financial plan is adopted. So this pie chart represents the assessed values for electoral areas. So as I mentioned in the other slide, the distribution amongst the property classes in electoral areas remains relatively unchanged from 2022. And then the residential, I talked about earlier, 71.6% of the total assessment base are residential properties in electoral areas. Residential non-market change. This means new construction. So all electoral areas experience new construction growth in their tax base, with the exception of electoral area A, which saw a slight decline in the number of properties that are part of your assessment base. Okay. This chart illustrates the average growth in residential property assessments from 2022 to 2023 for each electoral area and member municipality. You will note on this chart, it's based on the preliminary roll data, which each electoral area director had the ability to see in December. So we have this slide again, the next slide with the completed assessment roll. So on this one, I point out that the most significant increase was Harrison Hot Springs, and electoral area D had the lowest level of increase. And that was Harrison Hot Springs had an average increase of 21%, and electoral area D was at 8%. Now I'll move on to the next slide, which is with the most current data. Okay, let me move along my slides here at home. Okay, so Harrison Hot Springs is now at 13% with the new data, and electoral area D, pardon me, I can't slide that along. electoral area D and moved up to 9% actually. So there was a slight change. So generally speaking, as BC Assessment refines their data amongst each of their roles, which they call it, generally property values go down as they're correcting information and or receiving input from the public, from property owners in January when they call for that appeal process to begin. So generally property values go down, but in some cases they correct some anomalies and there may be slight changes. Okay, so the next section is the FVRD assets at risk. Okay, so we continue to strive to make sure our assets are maintained in a state of good repair. We want to make sure that we have adequate financial planning for the future needs. That's considering maintenance, replacement, planned replacement, and a contingency for unplanned events. As I mentioned earlier, we're trying to make sure that we're reasonable in our predictions, that we're not overtaxing, for example, that we're not looking for the gold standard, but we're also making sure that we're not going to create shockwaves in taxation should something go astray. So we want to make sure that we have that right level and continue to have a steady financial plan and tax policy that looks for steady, predictable increases for the residents and property owners so that we know that our reserves are adequate should something go amiss and or when the replacement is scheduled. As we know, if something does go unscheduled and we need to repair an asset in a certain service area and it wasn't budgeted, we would go ahead through necessary board approval with the timelines given the dollar amounts, I shall say. And then we have to tax for it the next year. You can't defer that. It's not a payment plan. You have to tax. You can't leave a deficit in a service area. So that's what I mean a shockwave. So if there's something unforeseen happened in a service area and we didn't have the reserve, that's what would happen. We would have a large deficit, and then next year we would have to tax those property owners for it. So that's what we're trying to avoid. And the next few slides will continue to speak on this. So we have completed some early works on the estimated asset replacement valuation and the level of funds that should be required and should be contributed on an annual basis in order to achieve that right level of reserve funding. So we consider the condition of the asset. Can we stretch it longer than it needs to be, or do we have to replace it sooner? What is the lifespan? What reserve balances do we have to date? And that all comes together to inform our reserve contributions. And in essence, it's our taxation levels. So this is where each of the budget owners, we say budget owners, the managers and directors, they use their professional opinions and their expertise and experience to take all of these facts and then combine them into their best recommendations, which we've brought forward. As I mentioned earlier, we have an asset management program. We updated the board in November, and the FVRD strategic plan includes 2 specific initiatives that will move the dial to ensure the FVRD is managing risk and financial implications that best serve our property owners. So we'll be developing an asset management policy, and we'll also be preparing a capital reserve fund policy to meet those funding targets for asset replacement and renewal. So we have strategic initiatives identified to assist in the guidance and the development of capital plans and adequate levels of taxation. In the meantime, we have previously elevated certain electoral area budgets for the board's awareness on as the levels of reserve funds are not at the levels that it could have serious impacts should infrastructure fail or major works be required ahead of schedule. So I'll briefly cover these budgets, but keep in mind we have the budget managers here as well if we had any questions. But this information has been previously shared with the board and with the electoral area directors in the fall. So the next 3 slides are tables like this. They illustrate these service areas that have been identified as assets at risk, and you'll see the status, amber, medium level, and the red or high alert assets at risk. And while the EA directors this year, yourselves, have supported the replacement reserve contributions that are in line with the expectations of the requirements in the future, This only moves the dial, but doesn't eliminate the risk in 1 year. But we're pleased. So we've put the update here, 2023 update. You'll notice in each of them, recommended replacement reserve contributions have been supported by the EA director. So we're pleased on that, and we hope that trend continues in advance of something going astray, and making sure that we're ready for replacement for each of these service area assets.
Yeah, excuse me, I apologize, Ms. Lounsborough. Director Dixon would like to ask a question.
Certainly.
Thank you. Thank you for your help. I'm just looking at some of these assets at risk, and some have a reserve and some have a surplus and some have only one or the other. And so, yes, maybe I should know this by now, but I really don't have a solid understanding. Like, how do you get a surplus? If we're paying into reserve or making contributions from the tax base, I guess, where does the surplus come from?
Great question, Director Dixon. Thank you for asking that. So reserves are something that we deliberately set aside for capital. So those dollars can only be set and used for capital. And there's a deliberate, distinct decision that has been made at a point in time to put those dollars in a reserve. And each of these reserves has a bylaw that specifies the exact usage. But generally, I can say the reserve funds are for capital, so large expenditures and not day-to-day operating expenses. Sometimes the decision could be made to leave funds in surplus to have a little bit more flexibility should some repairs be needed, and generally repairs may not be considered capital. So it's nice to have a little bit of that flexibility. Sometimes sometimes on the surplus can arise if there's savings in a particular year. Any savings will automatically go to surplus. However, there may have been budgeted contributions to surplus as well. So it might have been a decision. So each of these, there's a little bit of history, but generally speaking, reserves are for capital and surplus can be used for general operating activities. And that would arise, the surplus would arise as a result of savings in a particular year and or a distinct decision to put dollars into surplus. Okay, so this is slide 2 of 3. Again, there's 3 service areas at risk here. We have the Yale Water System, Morris Valley Sewer, and the drainage in East Popcom. And the forecasted reserve balances, we're just finalizing our year end for 2022. In parallel with the 2023 financial planning process, and our forecasted reserve balances and surplus balances are shown here in the third column. And the final slide covers the last 3 service areas that we have at risk. We have Rexford Creek Flood Protection, DeRoche Water, and North Cultus Sewer. So each of these service areas, the recommendations put forward by staff have been supported by the directors. Okay, I will now move on to the electoral area financial summaries. Okay, oops. Okay. So this slide represents the total electoral area-wide budgets. So we are proposing an increase of $403,000 compared to 2022 taxation levels. We'll be discussing in detail 3 of these budgets, but as I mentioned earlier, if you would like to go into the others, we have included those in the committee of the whole materials, and we are happy to talk through those as well, should there be any questions. You'll note so these are each of the electoral area increases and the proposed budgets. So we have electoral area administration, building inspection, emergency management, bylaw enforcement, animal control, electoral area planning, and regional library. So this just shy of $403,000 is comprised of I should point out in the building inspection area, $23,000 of the building inspection area is funded by Harrison Hot Springs. Therefore, the remainder of the the increase of 403,000 is actually 366,000, which is attributable to the electoral areas. And when we get to the emergency management budget, we have some notes on that, but I shall point out for comparative purposes, the taxation levels for 2022 show $88,000. However, we did have a one-time funding injection for certain projects that distorted that figure. So the increase looks greater than it otherwise normally would have been. Okay, so this slide, I'll just move to the next slide. This slide reflects all budgets that are uniformly applied to each taxpayer within an electoral area. So again, today we'll be reviewing the electoral area-wide service budgets today, and they're included in the calculations here. However, these figures also include electoral area specific budgets that are for each of your electoral areas, which we've already covered. And these figures also include the regional service area budgets. So if we were to look at the electoral area-wide budgeted tax impacts, which are the subject of today's meeting, I'm going to run through the impacts of those. So on this slide at the top, I shall cover off the first part. The overall requisition increases in the top section. So the overall requisition increase for each of your electoral areas is shown in that first row. Requisition increase from 2022. So for electoral area A, it's just shy of 52,000, and all the way to electoral area H, 118,000. We've shown the average residential property assessments for each of 2022 and 2023 for each of your areas. And then you can see that the variation of the average residential assessment base, the increases. So the average property went up in electoral area A, despite losing some properties on the non-market change. And electoral area H on average went up 8%. So the overall property tax impact for those tax areas or service areas that are uniformly applied to consistently to each property within your area is shown as the 2023 property tax impact. So in electoral area A, it's $619 as compared to 2022, which was $479. So $140 increase in annual basis. And likewise, that's shown for each of the electoral areas, moving right to electoral area H, which is a $69 increase for all of the different service area budgets. So regional, sub-regional, electoral area wide, and then electoral area H. And these are what we call above the line. These are before the specific parcel taxes. And then the impact, while we haven't shown the impact for each of the electoral area-wide budgets for the average property owner, it is in those slides that we've previously shown in our electoral area meetings, and we have them in the resource slides. I will, for ease, run through what those impacts are. So the subject of today's meeting, those budgets that are subject of today's meeting. So for comparison, if you look at electoral area A, it's $140 for all types of the budgets. So the subject of today's meeting, though, for electoral area A is a $13.05 increase for the average property. In electoral area B, the impact of the budgets we're proposing today is $20.11. For electoral area C, the impact of today's budgets that we're reviewing is $47.45 compared to the total of $56 for all of the electoral area-wide budgets in electoral area C. Moving on to electoral area D, the overall tax impact for all properties in electoral area D is just shy of $52 for the year, and today's budgets represent $49.60 of that $51.72. In electoral area E, the overall tax impact is just shy of $46, and today's budgets represent $28.76. Electoral area F, the overall total for the electoral area-wide budgets is $41, and today we're talking about $38.08. And again, these figures are all in the resource section for each of your areas. Electoral area G, we have just shy of $39, and the majority of that again is today's content. And then electoral area H, just over $45 compared to your $69 of the total. So $45 is part of today's meeting.
Excuse me, Kelly, I apologize, but could you explain to me once again the difference between those two figures?
These figures here that are on the slide include regional service area budgets. They include electoral area D specific budgets that are applied all just to each of your areas. So regional, sub-regional, electoral area wide, as well as the EA budgets. So those budgets that are applied uniformly to each of your properties. So I can, would you like me to go to one of these?
For example, fire would be included in that. Is that right?
The
fire budgets?
No, those are specific service area budgets for certain properties.
So the difference between the low number and the high number is regional costs. Is that right?
Yes.
And what else?
Regional, sub-regional, electoral area wide, which we're talking about today,
Right.
and then electoral area. So your regional, your grant and aids, for example.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for explaining that.
Okay. Yes, you're welcome. And again, those are all in your slides later on, but this is the big picture impact. And then those figures I reported out verbally, those are also in the resource section, but those are the impact of what we're talking about today. Okay. Okay. So the next section of the presentation, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague Beth Klein to go over each of the electoral area wide budgets. So the next budget we have here is electoral area administration.
Yeah. So I'm not sure that I've got the procedure for today's meeting totally. I don't have a totally good understanding for it, but as I understand it, Director Dixon and myself met with our CAO earlier this morning and discussed whether it might be better to have a more wide-ranging discussion about EA-wide budgeting, because partially because so many new directors are with us, but after 20 years, I often feel I don't have a good understanding of this. But the suggestion is that we might schedule another meeting and have a really open and frank discussion about EA-wide budgets. And maybe I'll turn things to our CEO.
Sure. Thank you, Director Dickey. So my understanding is that Director Dixon was going to put forward a motion to recess today's proceedings and give staff some further direction. I don't know if you wanted to offer Director Dixon that opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, I'd like to move. Have the wording. So part of it is that there are some increases that just we're thinking could use maybe need a little more information on it. So the motion is just to recess today's meeting. I gotta find it. I didn't write it out. Yeah, and
I think you actually emailed it to me. Hang on one second. I can read it out if that's helpful.
Sorry,
Is that helpful? No, that's okay. So I think what you had emailed me was that you were going to move that we recess the committee of the whole and refer the 2023 to 2027 electoral area wide budget back to staff for review and consideration of ways the budget can be further reduced, and bring back those proposals to a meeting on January 26th, 2023. And for the rest of the committee's benefit, I would suggest that that meeting would be best to take place right prior to the board meeting.
that's the motion. I'd like to move that.
Okay, so we'll need a seconder. Second, Director Johnson, discussion.
Davidson.
Yeah, go ahead, Director Davidson.
So I'm not quite sure what we were discussing in such a meeting that we wouldn't be can't or wouldn't discuss today. So I'm not quite
Good.
following the need.
Thank you. That's a good question. I'll turn that to our CAO.
Sure, I can speak to that. So in conversation with your chair and vice chair, there is some concerns about the escalating costs of various services. And what Director Dixon has directed staff in the motion is for all of the EA area-wide budgets for staff to take another look and bring forward proposals for reductions to those budgets, those specific budgets that are on the agenda today.
Okay. And today we are in an open meeting. Would this follow-up meeting be also open?
Well, there would be an opportunity for a closed meeting because certainly service reductions comes with various consequences that might be better discussed in closed.
Okay.
So
I'll allow Director Davidson to follow up.
okay, so maybe if I'm speaking to the motion, I would say that I'm still not quite clear on this, because when we get to the motion, that's at the end of today, there's an opportunity to speak on that motion. There's opportunity there to take that deeper dive into these matters of do we need this much, where can we cut, whatever. So, but I guess what I'm hearing then is that staff essentially would need to prepare for that, for it to be valuable.
Through the
Okay.
chair to Director Davidson, that's correct. We were not prepared today to make recommendations of where the best opportunities for reductions would be. And I would not recommend doing that on the fly in the face of a CAL meeting. I think that it would be best if staff went back to the drawing board and had some available options for you to consider, so that when we get into the service area budgets, we can best advise you what would be the most recommended option.
Okay, so I think I'm actually going to speak against the motion or not support the motion today, simply because when I look at that amount of increase over the all the services we're talking about today, to me it's nominal. We already know we have a 6 to 7% inflation we need to speak to. The bulk of it seems to be around emergency management, and for the benefit of the new directors. This is last term, prior to COVID, we had local government, the province did an audit of our emergency management services, and we came up pretty short. All sorts of areas for all sorts of improvement. And then after the atmospheric river event, we had an after action review that was done. And again, all sorts of areas for all sorts of improvement. So when you look at that slide that indicates where these percentages are coming across the service areas we're talking about today, to me, it seems entirely reasonable. And the only area that you're going to be shaving, you're going to be looking at reducing services to basically counteract the impact of inflation, or you're going to be looking at not expanding the emergency management side of it. And that's clearly based on the last 12 months. I mean, to consider not increasing our emergency management side, to me is I just don't want to go there. So I'm looking to not burden further staff with this. So I would like to just carry on with the thing. We'll get to the vote at the end of the day, the end of today, and we'll still we'll know where everybody else stands. But I'm not in favor of going back and looking at cuts at this time.
Good. Thank you, Director Davidson. Director McMahonic.
Thank you. So I was kind of surprised. I didn't know that this was going to be done, but I work with budgets, and since COVID and then climate events, costs are more. There's no way around it. And my understanding was that budgets were approved and that people had meetings and this was done. And looking at the overall budget, and I've reviewed everything, and I tend to agree with Director Davidson, and I think it's reasonable. And you know, they're saying inflation is around 7%, but I mean, I'm just looking at costs with everything that I'm doing in a similar budget running an organization, and there's really not a lot of room to cut. I just don't see it. I thought it was pretty conservative considering what costs are anticipated. And I would, I don't think that there's much room to cut without putting, I think the risks of cutting are far outweigh any benefits. And that's my position. And I do have experience, a long experience of running budgets. So that's just my 2 cents. Thank you.
Good. Thank you, Director Makahonic. Director Castle.
Thank you, Chair Dickey. My understanding of the increase in the emergency department comes around funding unfunded staff position. And when we're talking about a tune of 10-12% increase, I'd like to know what the greatest needs are. I don't want to give an impression that emergency preparedness isn't high on my list of priorities, but when we are dealing with global inflation of 7 or 8%, we need to consider the taxpayers' ability to absorb these costs in their already stretched household budgets. So I do appreciate the opportunity to have staff have another look and offer options for us to consider. So I'll support the motion.
Thank you, Director Castle. Director Wardenberg.
Yeah. I find this a little bit complicated, a little bit frustrating, the whole process. I wish there was options in front of us already. Maybe the process could be changed in the future. I would support this motion because it does and will give us some options, whether it be what we see today or something else. What we see today is obviously one option that I'm sure is going to come forward, and I look forward to other options as well. So I'll support the motion at this point. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Wardenberg. Anyone that would like to speak for the first time? Director Johnson.
Thank you, Chair. And I too support the motion.
Okay, thank you, Director Johnson. Looking to Director Davidson.
Thank you, Chair, and apologies. Just one brief afterthought that I realized I should have mentioned the first time around. We're talking about a total dollar change of, I'm hearing numbers like $40, $50, $12, depending on electoral area. That's the actual monetary value of the impact. So if you stop looking at the percentages and you look at that, and that this is basically what we're arguing, whether instead of, for example, for my area, instead of being $38, it really could be $33, and we're going to send staff back to explore that. And that's basically what I struggle with, the total impact on it, on somebody's property tax, which is an asset that's probably getting closer on average to, well, it's 6 figures everywhere anyway. It just seems to be a little bit out of context, but so I won't support, but thank you.
Good, thank you, Director Davidson. Director Johnson's light is on.
Just one further comment. I'm brand new at this. The only budgets I've ever had to deal with have been my own personal budget. So I certainly do not have years of experience, and I am trying my best to figure it out and sort through it. But how much can be saved for the taxpayers in my area, I have no idea, but I would like to explore that, because if you notice, the increase is greatest in area A, and I'm basically living in a bankrupted area. So people living in bankruptcy, $10, $12, or $13 is probably pretty huge. I'm not bankrupt personally, but the increase to my area is 3 times higher than some and twice that of others throughout all the districts, so areas. Anyway, that's my take. Thank you.
Good, thank you, Director Johnson. I might say that if we were to go into a meeting next week, that it would be a closed meeting, as we've been advised by staff, and that would allow us to maybe enter into some subject matter that isn't typically entered into in an open meeting, and with so many new directors, we could have a very frank discussion and ensure that we're all understanding as well as we can the process here. And that would give us a foundation to work from in future years.
If I can just interject for a moment, Chair Dickey, there are very specific prescribed reasons for going into closed. You would have an open meeting and an opportunity to go into closed. And the reasons for going into closed would be to discuss service and labor.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Kinnaman. Okay, any further discussion? Director Dixon.
Thank you. I do want to thank all the staff. I recognize obviously that a lot of work has gone into this, and important work and key work, and must be sometimes challenging trying to figure out what all of us directors are looking at. And I think for me, having options is, at least in a couple of the budget areas, might help with our understanding as well in what we can do, maybe what the impact of some of the decisions we've made over the years, or the potential impact. And I'm learning. I think most of us here are still learning, and but I want to make sure that I thank you for the work that's already gone into this. We'll see how it goes.
Good. Thank you, Director Dixon. And I'm sure.
Director Dickey,
Yeah,
I
go
see
ahead.
that Director Adamo has had his hand up.
Excuse me, I didn't see you there. Director Adamo, please
Right.
go.
Thanks very much through the chair to staff. Once again, thank you very much for this report as well. My comment is based on our initial presentation of the budget, the what I like to call the firing squad that we went through. For those of us that were brand new, I did find that process was quite challenging and intimidating, and having to make decisions on the fly. And while I understood what I was getting into when I took this on, I think perhaps we can look at a different method of making that particular presentation to certainly the newcomers that get into elected office when it comes to this budget, because it is a significant area of concern for all of us and all of our constituents. So I just wanted to address the method with which it was originally presented to us, and then this follow-up method right now, while fine, and I do understand and respect Mr. Davidson's position, I just think that we could do this a little bit differently, and I would support the motion to look at some things that we can do a little differently for that. So thank you very much, everyone. Good.
Thank you, Director Adamo. Any further discussion? I'd just like to echo the comments of Director Dixon that in no way is this a criticism of staff. Maybe we don't understand, but we try to understand how complicated and difficult this is for yourselves. I hope you might appreciate how difficult this is for electoral area directors who spend an hour or two here once a week, and trying to get a good understanding of just what the budgets mean and what impact they have in our communities is certainly challenging. And I think all of us find it difficult to make a decision without having a sense of confidence that we do have an understanding. So with that, Director Dixon or Director Davidson, please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, so on the basis of people being able to make knowledgeable decisions, I'll fully support the motion.
Good. Thank you, Director Davidson. Any further discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor? Contrary, motion carries.
Thank you, Chair Dickey. So that means that we are now in public question period for items relevant to the agenda, and we will just turn things over to our corporate officer, Jamie Van Ness.
We don't have anybody joining us in person today and nobody joining us online, so we can move on to the next item.
Thank you.
Looking for a motion to adjourn?
Motion, move Director Johnson, second Director Wardenberg. Any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor? Contrary, motion carries. Thank you, directors. Thank you, staff.
And thank you, committee. We will make sure that we send out an invite to when that next reconvening of the